University of York, and I am delighted to welcome you to this event under the aegis of the York Hope Consortium. As some of you might know, under the aegis of this consortium, we are convening an online symposium series on hope and social change. And we've really been running a series of events starting from January, in which our participants reflect on the ways in which hope and social change shape each other. We've been thinking about what people's sources of hope are during times of uncertainty. How might people, cope with such uncertainties? How hope shapes broader processes of social change, and how might hope be slightly different from such concepts as optimism, aspiration, and desire. We've been exploring examples of collective and non-collective action, social movements, and popular politics, as well as civic solidarity and everyday politics that construct hope. And so through these series, we've had combinations of individual presentations and group-based panel discussions on hope and what people understand by hope. All these events are recorded and are also available on our YouTube channel, which I will ask our wonderful colleague, Melissa Williams, to share at some point in the chat. And of course, do keep following us on social media to get more updates. In terms of our panelists today, we're delighted to sort of have with us Simon Parker, who's a professor at politics at the University of York. So welcome, Simon. Carol Guyett, Senior Research Fellow at the CNRS. I hope I got that right, Carol, but correct me if I've got anything wrong. Welcome, Carol. And Suryakant Wagmore, Professor of Sociology at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. I hope I got that right. Of course, each of them have lots of other credentials, lots of other things that they've been doing. I will not bog you down with those details. One can run an entire seminar on that. Okay, so what I'd like to do really is to, start our opening gambit, as it were, is to ask each of our panelists on how they understand hope. And then from that initial conversation to really take things further. So maybe go in any order you like, but perhaps I'll leave it to you. So between Simon, Carol, and Suryakant,
Follow the order we were introduced. So Simon, Carol, and Suryakant.
Yes, I knew you'd say that, Suryakant. That's very predictable. All right, Simon, go for it.
Okay, well, it looks like I've drawn the first straw. So yeah, I mean, I thank you very much for the invitation, and it's great to be taking part in this conversation with my esteemed colleagues from Paris and Bombay, Mumbai, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the project that we're all involved in, and particularly the respective cities that we've been working on for the past 12, 18 months. But going back to your initial question, Indraja, I think for me, kind of generically, I would say that hope is a belief in the possibility of positive change. So at a fundamental level. But I think we probably need to draw a distinction between kind of individual hope, which I think you were sort of hinting at in your introduction, which I think can be often takes the form of a more perhaps a more spiritual motivation, in that it's often associated, I think, with a kind of a sense that the kind of universe is not conducive sometimes to the kind of the life or well-being that we would like or expect, whether it's to do with health, whether it's to do with problems that you or family members might be experiencing, and so forth. And I think that kind of reflects the fact that individuals are often pitted against very adverse circumstances. And I guess the point of religion often is to sort of provide some kind of sense of psychic compensation, perhaps, for an unfair world. And that one of the, so in prayer, for example, we offer hope for deliverance from difficult circumstances and so on. And I think that also probably extends even in a more secular context to when we might say kind of banally, well, I hope this interview goes well, or I hope this date goes well, right? Because it's also a kind of a bargain against a kind of very uncertain world in which often outcomes are likely to be more negative than positive. So I think it's partly kind of that recognition that that as individuals, the odds are generally stacked against us unless you come from very elite, privileged proportions of the population, which, as we know, is a very tiny minority. So I think this is quite a widespread sense. It's something we've all kind of experienced when we know that dice are kind of broadly loaded against us. But I think when it moves to the level of the collective, then I think it becomes something else. So, and that's kind of what I suppose I and others are probably more interested in as social scientists, right? So I think that when we think about hope in terms of collective aspirations, then what we are really talking about, in a sense, is hope as a kind of a quasi-political phenomenon, and as you've discussed in previous symposia from other contributors, I think we probably all agree to some extent that at its root there has to be some aspiration towards social justice or some more equal distribution, shall we say, of opportunities, rewards, etc. And I think this comes back to the fact that those who are going to quote Raymond Williams, who are dependent on the resources of hope, have to be dependent on those sorts of aspirations because they lack the material resources, as it were, to change their circumstances for the better, right? So I think it's very much about this sense of a kind of a collective imaginary, which is partly reflecting a felt sense of injustice and a belief, nevertheless, that by combining together and by sharing one's sense of anger, frustration, and the need for a kind of a more equitable future, that the balance of power can somehow be tipped to the advantage of the disadvantaged. Okay, so that's kind of, I guess, where I come from in a broad sort of conceptual sense in relation to hope, but then I'm very happy to go into sort of more concrete details, but perhaps I'll let my own account first, if that's okay.
Absolutely, Simon. I think that really helps to start off, thinking about hope as in terms of, collective sort of aspirations towards, as you put it, tilting the balance of power in favor of the disadvantage. I think that's a very useful sort of point to pin down and maybe agree or disagree with as we move down the line, but that's helpful. Thanks, Simon. Carol, did you want to come in?
Yes, well, there are many ideas already that Simon has articulated, so it's difficult because I want to keep going on the discussion, but also I wanted to stress a few points. One aspect for me, and it refers also to what you underlined introducing the discussion, Indrajit, was about the difference between hope and desire or optimism. I think that hope is not an opinion. And it's not something that you just can have individually. Of course, at the individual level, you can articulate it, but it is just as other aspects of habits and character, really social from one point to another. And it's a way to connect individual perceptions of social life and more broader, historically situated and socially anchored aspects of social life. So I think that it's important for us to study hope in this way, and it's rather an orientation and a practical principle of valuation and of investment, of commitment of people in situations, and a way of transcending present difficulties and to defining what's relevant in order to orient themselves in the future. So it's really, it really has to do with the role of imagination in social life. And I think that it's a challenge for social sciences to grasp that, to study that, and that's part of what we're trying to do. And also another suggestion I would have is to say that it relates different temporalities. So it has this well, as imagination does, it helps to bring about different kinds of integration. So the personal integration from everyday life and everyday situations with a biographical perspective on the personhood and the self, and the constitution of this biographical perspective. And so how can one manage it, even if within very constrained situation, very facing really hard difficulties, how you manage to give yourself a moral responsibility and choices and agency for your own life. So and what we find, and maybe we'll develop more about that, but these kinds of hopes, we can find them in every human being. And so within very poor people living at the margin because they are undocumented, or because they're unemployed, or very so poor that they're living at the margin of society, but they invest differently so that they can manage to create some agency. And this orientation towards the future, it's really what helps them transcend the really so difficult present, in order to develop a sense of self, and to be like that a little bit with a sense of well, they're leading their own life. And also there's this biographical perspective, but there's also this connection between the moral aspect of action and the more political. And so what are the levels and the perimeters which allow people to articulate their sense of good personhood, agency, and connecting to the wider society. So, and this is very important, because what the perimeters are, is it only within the family, with these very familiar ties, the neighborhood, the parish, or maybe the really wider society? And this is really an important way of understanding how people think their political agency, and how it is connected to their sense of what they can do, or what they cannot do for themselves and for the society in a wider sense. So that's it for the main topics that I wanted to underline there.
Thanks, Carol. I think it's really, really fascinating to think about political agency in the way that you've sort of mentioned, and also the temporality aspect. You know, it's about, of course, looking at the past, but also transcending temporalities, as you said, looking at the past, but with an eye on the future, and of course, doing things in the here and now. And I think in that way, it's quite fascinating. Again, something we could agree or disagree with, but I think it's quite fascinating to think about hope in terms of political agency. Thank you. Surikant.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much, Carol and Simon. Now, what you have both laid for us is one. Rather, from Simon, what we get is the political nature of hope. When we need to think of hope, we cannot not think of inequalities. Right? So one therefore invests a lot of power in hope at the margins, because one is also looking at emancipation as something that is key to human endeavors, right? So therefore, we need to look at how do marginal groups make meaning of hope? And that's a very important point, and therefore we need to move towards solidarities, right? So how do groups that do not enjoy traditional economic or cultural power, how do they make sense of their collectives to change their contemporary present lives, right? And though we do not want to understand hope as aspiration, but what this collective idea of hope does is helps us comprehend a broader idea of hope, which is not merely material, not educational, but there's also a moral dimension to it. And like I said, this renders the whole project political. Now, what I would like to briefly share here, also drawing from Carol, the importance of biographical or ethnographical, right, the everyday, and therefore the real challenges that we see in making hope real, right? What I could draw from is a mix of, because our project is on cities, I could draw from my past work on rural Maharashtra, and then make a case for why cities spatially constitute a specific form of collective solidarity and hope, which is linked to the rural as well. So first of all, let me make this point that hope is also spatially structured in one sense. So we need to therefore locate hope spatially structured, and it can also be limited spatially. To what we see is in India, and I'm trying to work on this idea that hope is largely influenced by collective ideas of self. So here, what is important is, ideas of religion, ideas of caste. So in one sense, hope therefore may move in waves for individuals, right? Waves where the social becomes important, the political, sometimes the economic, educational, or sometimes like Simon said, the spiritual or the religious one. But there is a collective dimension here to it, which we should not undermine. Now, what cities help us do is, at least in India, is to look at how hope is not limited due to its rurality in villages, right? So first of all, while I'm making this point, let me also emphasize that hope in itself is a conflictual process. Because while we may focus on hope of marginalized collectives, there is also varied, and like it's discrete, it's hierarchical in India. Various collectives are hoping for various things, right? So for instance, my work on Marathas is a dominant caste in Marathwada. Over years, or last 15 years, and there have been limited studies on this in terms of, for instance, looking at the collective hope of Marathas. Marathas were a kingly caste in rural Maharashtra, and now they claim to be victims of the changes that has happened over a period of time. So there is an idea of collective hope. This is pushing against several anxieties that the community is facing, because several other groups have prospered socially, educationally. Now here is a new space, both rural and semi-urban, where things that were, for instance, there are castes like Banjaris, which are lower OBCs, the lower, they're not untouchables, but a little higher. But such castes were never seen as equals with the dominant caste. But here is a space where, you will see Banjaris with motorcycles, with cars. So the Maratha idea of hope, like Simon said, the collective now aspires to chase the state for more social justice, in the sense, in one way they have been dominating the state, but the whole discourse of hope changes, right? So in fact, what one is seeing is the discourse of social justice that marginal groups used is being used by dominant groups. So and what is also important here is that's why religion and caste. I can go on this, but I think for me, as part of this study on cities, also drawing from this previous project on withering caste, I think one of the major hindrances to making hope a genuinely emancipatory project in cities in India has been the tyranny of cousins, that follows because of collective identities. So an individual, in one sense, does not emerge. So, so there is, in one sense, violence of hope of the collectives, where the individual who wants to think beyond his caste, religion, and be this fluid self in the city is simply impossible. So this is one of maybe if theoretical advances which we may make if we look at these collective hopes, the competitions, and what does it do to individuals, and what does this do finally to the society in the long run, right? So how does one then look at, for instance, what contemporary research, at least in Bombay, would tell you that now poverty is something that is cutting across several castes in cities, right? But why do we not have class collectives, right? And what we see is, the poor, they do struggle. They do struggle, and these varied struggles, however, one, do not emerge as class collectives, and also are stacked against several marginal groups in themselves at times. So that's why, I mean, one is to get how collectives aspire and work towards this hope, but second is what do they do in that process to the society as a whole. So I think it is this question that we should also, I mean, this is not, this is just a call to kind of look at, those who are working on hope to do. And like I said, land or space is something very important. So in villages, you see a lot of landless groups struggling for land, violence that they face, at times succeed, do not succeed. I have worked on this before. Now, what we do see in cities is struggle for house, right? And I have said this before that the Indian welfare mechanism, it's the state itself hopes to do a lot, but we hardly achieve much. So what we have is minimal welfare and maximum hope, and it is amongst the marginal groups. And it is here that we see, marginal groups encroaching on public land. So there is this tension, not merely with the state, but also with other collective marginal, other collective identities, other marginal groups. So it is in this context, right? Again, what rather I would make this argument again that because hope is structured by culturally constituted communities, what is central to the project of hope is the project of othering. So you cannot really hope without having someone to go after. I'll not go in detail, but what is happening around, you may have a look at that. And so that's why somehow we need to weave this into our struggle to make hope as something that constitutes radical change in both ideas and actions of groups and communities. I think I'll stop here. Thanks, Indrajit, for making me think.
Thanks. No, I think it's really useful to also, in addition to what's been said, think about the conflictual dimension of hope. We are used to, of course, thinking about hope as this very fuzzy thing, and it is indeed fuzzy, but there is a fuzziness that comes with edges, and some of those edges are hard, and sometimes they're necessary. I mean, I think to go back to the point that was made earlier, you can't sort of tilt the balance of power in the favor of the disadvantaged without entailing some sort of conflict, without entailing some sort of contradiction, as it were. So I think it's really useful to think about that and to bring that up front as well, rather than try and abstract it out of the discussions. Each of you, of course, made reference to being co-conspirators with each other in the Citizenship Futures project. So I think that's a useful sort of way to also think about, and the point that you made at the end, Surikant, about cities. The project is based on urban areas. There's a certain urbanity to hope, which whether we like cities or not, we can't ignore. So I think that's also something worth thinking about. How cities promise hope, I guess, is a question that emerges. I mean, at this stage, I don't know if any of you had any questions for each other. I guess that it might be useful to broach that if you like.
I just wanted just to suggest something, because I was wondering, hearing Suryakant and your reaction about the conflictual dimension. I was thinking maybe it's really analytical, an analytical perspective to develop. And the comparative aspects of fieldworks would probably benefit from that. How come it becomes more or less conflictual and politicized? And this idea of what Suryakant stressed, that, in India, you cannot just turn your back to the conflictual dimension of hope and to the collective part of, there's no emancipation of the self from the collective. Yeah. And so maybe the conflictual is really tied to that. Because what I see in the French context is more that, people, it's what is often referred to as apathy. And, they just distance themselves from these nationwide politics where nothing really concerns their lives and their hopes. So they turn their backs to that, and they concentrate in low-level entities and aspects of hope. And so there's a lack of framing the political conflictual aspect of their hope. And so, and I think that maybe that's a way of understanding, this idea of how much hope gets conflictual, or how you just divide between and just renounce the entering the conflictual wider aspects of what collective hope would entail. That's maybe a really important thing to describe and to analyze for us.
Absolutely. No, I think it's easy to fall into this sort of one size fits all kind of approach, but I think that's where the comparative dimension that you're referring to makes sense. What is it that's pushing for the different sorts of hope, or the whether there's conflict or there's apathy, or maybe there's apathy which sort of there's apathy because the institutions don't allow the conflicts to explode, whereas perhaps elsewhere the institutions aren't strong or are in fact complicit in letting conflict explode. And here, of course, one is used to thinking about conflict in a negative sense, but of course there's a generative dimension of conflict, which is again something that one can't ignore. But I think that's really worth, I think, for us also to think about further with the kind of data that might emerge from the field. I'm tempted to almost ask, but I don't know if Simon has any other sort of comments he wants to make. But I'm tempted to sort of pick on the last point that was made by you, Carol, as well as going back to what Suryakant said about cities. Is there anything in particular that cities do that makes them more conducive to hope? Whether it's emancipating the self from the community, as was put earlier, or the lack of it, indeed, or the fact that there are just so many different selves that can be at play. So I don't know if there's something anyone wants to come in on specifically in terms of what is it about cities that pushes you towards hope.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I think Suryakant's absolutely right about that rural urban distinction, and I think it's something that social scientists have been observing all the way back to Simmel. You think about the old German expression, Stadt Luft macht's frei, city air makes you free, is kind of really contrasting that with Tönnies' distinction between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, essentially, right? So a highly kind of surveyed, supervised small village community, and as Suryakant was sort of hinting, is the kind of tyranny of cousins is very much there. But it's not to say that, of course, it disappears in urban settlements, particularly in informal urban settlements. And I think that's another thing that we have to acknowledge is, not all cities are the same. That's not to say that there is a kind of a net distinction between urban life in the global north and the global south, but it is to say, I think, because you saw the same, the Chicago sociologists back in the 20s and 30s were observing this same kind of village type social behavior of hyper-surveillance in the 1920s and 1930s with the sort of Polish and German community and so on and so forth. Right, so this kind of moral surveillance is there, and I think it does kind of set limits to how you can imagine a different world. Nevertheless, it is also the case that that it dissolves social bonds, and it creates there are at the same time you have a problem. We know there's a sort of problem with alienation and ennui that the sort of city generates, but at the same time on the positive, it kind of forces people into a recognition of how can we put it, sort of identity through status categories which weren't there before. In other words, you start increasingly to think in terms of occupation, perhaps rather than caste, or perhaps rather than the village you came from, and so on and so forth. And I think that's really important in terms of the kind of the collective mobilizations that we saw at the end of the 19th, early 20th century in big urban areas. Unionization, but also forms of political association, which led to sort of modern political parties and so on, would not have been possible in these small, more rural communities. And I think that's really important in terms of how you think about the vision of possibilities and the kind of solidarities that Suryakant were talking about, which often come from being kind of pitched into sort of similar levels of adversity as strangers. And I've just been reading kind of Chatterjee's kind of series of lectures. He's talking about Kolkata and West Bengal in that sense, really interesting about how those squatter communities, in those colonies sort of became kind of politicized by virtue of the fact that they were all in the same situation. They had no resources other than their kind of collective ability to provide voice, and a challenge to the authorities. And of course, you see that across many other cities in India, and the majority urban world, right? So I think there's something really important about what Suryakant was saying around cities generating potential spaces for solidarity, which not to say that they don't exist in rural communities, but they certainly take different forms. And I think that's, and I think it's also important in terms of how those different forms of solidarity in more rural settings may well be constrained by the sorts of perhaps more conservative values. And Gramsci, of course, talked about this very interestingly. And he was contrasting kind of the politics of the Mezzogiorno to, big cities like Turin. And, why did the sort of red years happen in the big cities of the north and not in the south? It was to do with that kind of dynamic transformation of urban space, by mostly kind of peasants coming in from, the islands in the south, finding themselves hyper exploited, and finding resources of hope and possibility with each other. And I think that's something which is still very much there. It's not going away. And I think big capital would like to think it's just going to disappear, but it's still very present in lots of struggles in lots of cities around the world today.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's again a very useful to think across the North-South, within the North-South, but also across the North-South sort of binary, as it were. Surikant, I'm aware that it's almost time for you to sort of want to leave, or I mean, you're welcome to stay if you can, but I don't know if you wanted to come in at this stage and sort of, respond to any of the points that have been made.
The 10 more minutes, I can wait till then, but quickly, Simon, thanks. And like Rit is saying, we need to kind of compare. But this point that Simon made again of, then what are these collectives that are in between, the closed ones and in the sense beyond the closed ones? That should definitely constitute a space of hope for scholars themselves to study. That's in terms of theorizing hope and its emancipatory possibilities. So I think that's a good suggestion. Again, drawing from my own work, and of course this project, we cannot go in details because they are really there's lots happening there. But this work that we did, the previous project on withering caste in cities, and what we saw is the personal space, the family as a space, because a lot of this, if you were to call it what Simon says, conservative ideas, do emanate are important at the familial level, at least. So therefore, this project also was looking at, how does an individual go beyond family, right? And what is definitely happening in cities like Bombay is, you cannot practice your ideas of tradition, culture, the way you can do it in villages. So a lot of, ideas of purity, pollution changes. What we are also seeing is, domestic workers now increasingly come across caste. This is Bombay, and I distinguish it from what I call as Gandhi's Ahmedabad and maybe Ambedkar's Bombay. That's the difference. But like you said, Simon, these are the spaces of hope. Right? Now, would this, and this is my hope, would this translate into solidarities across marginal groups? Would we have something new, for instance, domestic workers association that demands its rights, in some substantial sense beyond caste? Because what we see is increasingly there are domestic workers from what I call mentioned this dominant Maratha caste as well, right? The study did not throw this. Sadly, the Maratha workers were saying, no, we are different. And it's like Karul said, the biography isn't sadly encouraging here. But city does offer much more than what, meaning I'm not, again, I'm not doing this old type of distinction between rural and city, because see, a lot of city travels back to villages. And that's why we see a lot of violence in villages. So in that sense, ideas are circulating both ways, but it is city that kind of produces this hope. I mean, if you want to take, if I want to put it, that's too much in there, but it kind of emerges, this thing that one can be individual beyond one's given identity and be more is sadly a city thing. I mean, I'm saying sadly because 70% of India is rural, but yeah. So yes, so yeah. Briefly, I wanted to just add this.
But of course, as you said, people are circulating between rural and urban, so it may not be as sad as that. I mean, this is what the official.
In the sense, the space limits hope. That's the irony of it. Otherwise, I mean, we are in a good place, but things are changing, like you said. Yeah.
Carol, was there anything in particular, because you talked about apathy at one point, and it sort of nicely, talks about this final point that Surikant was making about, people passing through cities, and, there are restrictions, there are disappointments, if you will. And it spoke, I thought, to what you said earlier about apathy. So I don't know if you wanted to come in a bit on that.
Well, the thing is that what ethnography allows is to go underneath the supposed apathy, because things do not translate into political conflict or political commitment in the common political science definition of it, that is voting or partisanship and classical forms of commitment in political life. But what ethnography allows is to document, to describe and the ways that people actually do things for the common world, the community, where they can do. So when we study hope in deprived neighborhoods, as we do it in our comparative project, it allows us to see, for instance, people and activities and places where we find this kind of agency and this type of resources that the city provides to reframe in a way our common classical definitions of political commitment, and we have these actions of civic action and solidarities that are under the radar of political science very usually, and that then are just because people don't go and vote, so we say, well, it's apathy. But then we see, and we saw that a lot during COVID, that people do care and do commit, but you have to go find. And so we see that, for instance, in these families, mothers play a really important role in weaving different aspects of domestic economic life, food, providing food and healthcare and things like that, from a few decades on until now have been ruled out of what's politic and what's political. And so now we see that we need a broader definition of what is civic action and civic commitment, and even how it can become something more generalized, more even conflictual in a way. And so I think that hope is a good entry point into that aspect of how people deal with and do what they can, and just not apathy is really not enough in that sense.
Excellent. No, I think I'm really glad you corrected that. It's alleged apathy rather than apathy itself. I mean, there are certain disciplines which would consider this apathy, and others which would sort of insist that you go beneath. But if I could just push further on the methodological aspect, and I think that's really, really useful, and you've all sort of talked about it. Of course, there's a sociological aspect and understanding, but within that there is the ethnographic aspect, which of course you've mentioned, Carol. But it also throws up the challenges of such an approach, especially faced with this other global worldwide challenge of COVID. How do you understand get beneath the veneer, so to speak? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on methodologically, looking at ethnographies and doing ethnographies in difficult circumstances. I mean, COVID is just one example, but of course there are so many other, reasons that could make ethnography difficult. It could simply be the existence of conflict in an urban zone, either violent or non-violent conflict. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts, Carol, on the ethnographic dimension, and I'd like to hear from the others as well, if there are any thoughts on the ethnography.
Well, as for me, and that's really, I think, the major point that when doing ethnography, we take from the anthropological tradition, right? Is that you have to make sense of how people think and act from within, and to really make sense of how they connect things, how they define differences and frontiers, and how our valuation, our process intertwined with practices. And so you don't think that the way people, you don't define things like in a propositional way. You don't have ideas on what's political, what's moral, what's good, what's important, what's hope, by asking people, what do you think hope is? But you follow them, you describe how, and then by describing very carefully what they do, then you make them talk about how they do it, why they do it this way, and actually comparative aspects works within a person's life and between their experiences. And so how valuation works, it's expensive because I want to keep money you have people being in urgency social housing, but they still keep a lot of money just to buy their son a Disney card so they can go to Disneyland. So and they just make a 1 hour longer travel to go to buy something which is 2 hours less. So there's this differentiation in investing, what you invest. So for the kid, it's, well, you can have the best because, well, you have this way of hierarchizing between things. And so it's very important to be there as much as possible. So with COVID, it was very difficult. But even though you're not there all the time and you cannot follow people, you have to make them talk about how they do things and how they see what they do and how it makes sense for them, and not have general propositions or statements about concepts or ideas or whatever.
Right. Sorry, Simon, I have to go, so I'll just take 2 minutes and kind of. I really, I mean, what Carol says, and that there's a lot of meaning and rather also power in doing this kind of study. So, and just to, because we have used this in our own research, I mean, I want to quickly add 2 other dimensions to the study of hope, or thinking on hope. And Indrajit will like this one. Hope is pragmatic. So we need to keep this in mind. But hope is also influenced, I've said this earlier, by ideology and more particularly religion. This is something that is coming through our study. So it's pragmatic in the sense, like Carol said, after pandemic, a lot of, for instance, auto drivers left their families in villages because it made economic sense, right? But that did not mean that their reliance on beliefs and ideas, on health, on various things changed, right? This helped them to adapt. I'm thinking of this idea of adaptive citizenship, where it goes together with, if hope is pragmatic, then one also adapts, and religion does give a lot of resource to adapt. This is something that I just wanted to quickly share here.
Thanks, Surikant.
So can I leave, Indrajit? I'm sorry, but
of course, it's a free country, Surikant.
No. It's a free country, but with you, I'm not sure. Huh?
Thank you. All this is recorded, by the way. But thank you so much, Surikant. Thank you so much for being joining us. Take care. Simon, did you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame we've lost Surikant, but I think we had a lot of very precious contributions from him to talk about. And I think that last point, adaptive citizenship, is a really strong one. And I think from our own research in East London and Mel Williams was very involved in a lot of that field work as well, so she can at some point maybe chip in. But I think one of the things that we worked with different groups, I guess you could call them, of marginalized populations. The one that sort of, I guess, presented the biggest challenge during the COVID pandemic from an ethnographic point of view was working with young asylum seekers. So because they were, they tend to be isolated anyway, but they were particularly so during the pandemic, having to, spend almost the whole day almost like kind of locked up in these hostel bedrooms, or sometimes with foster carers, with little phone credit, and so yeah, I mean, communicating them was very, very difficult, but it was made possible largely as a consequence of a voluntary organisation that works with the Albanian speaking community in London. And so that made me, and I just made a quick note of that, because I think one of the things that perhaps we haven't talked about, but we need to talk about more, is the importance of hope intermediaries, as you might call them, right? So in other words, organizations, sometimes it might be individuals. We talk a lot about faith groups, but these are usually not state actors, I think, which is really important to emphasize. They tend not to be. And what they often actually tend to be is kind of filling in the increasingly large gaps that exist. Certainly in sort of the European context, where the welfare state or welfare provision should be, particularly during the pandemic, there were huge gaps, and this was particularly true for asylum seekers, who often are not allowed access to public funds and support, or it's very, very minimal. And I'm sure Carol could testify to similar situations in the case of Paris. And so what we found, therefore, was that this organization, this community organization, was literally a lifeline to those individuals, and not just to young people, also to sort of many trafficked women, other families, older people who had no means of getting food, and so on and so forth. And they managed to sort of put together this amazing network of befrienders. Many of them were actually outside London and were kind of phoning and sending donations and so on. So it was an amazing sort of flowering of solidarity which emerged. And what I think, what our research, and then we were sort of just really looking at the tip of the iceberg, because this is an organization that's been working for many years with these communities. But I think what and the name of the organization is Hope in Albanian, right? Is Shpres, and I think this is kind of, I saved that punchline. So so this is really kind of a very practical demonstration of hope, and that's around that kind of sort of being there, in terms of being at the end of a telephone line, being willing to sort of get someone to drive around some cash or some money, when people are really in urgent difficulties, and the feeling that gives people who are otherwise facing really unbearable psychological pressures around the sort of threat of deportation. They may be being threatened by criminal gangs and so on and so forth, is literally life-saving, because these are people who are really kind of in some cases really understandably thinking that their lives are not worth it, and these kind of interventions do sometimes make the difference between life and death. So this is really kind of at the front line of the harshness of human existence. And to that extent, I think this isn't a kind of abstract, kind of theoretical question. It's very real, it's very concrete. That sort of solidarity, which again, as I said, is without it, it would be very difficult to see how these communities could survive. And I think this is true. We could talk about this in many other contexts. And I think one of the things that I think research, whether it's ethnographic research or other forms of research, needs to be more attentive to, is the role of these intermediaries, who are kind of literally keeping the social fabric just about together during neoliberal times, and with a kind of persistent assault, I think, on collectivities of solidarity. precisely because this is the type of politics, this is the type of, don't want to say, I'm not sure it's sort of, we can say it's sort of an ideology, but it's certainly a kind of a system of values which is antithetical to the politics of cynicism. And that's one of the things I wanted to sort of say at the beginning, perhaps what I forgot, which was, I think we should always be careful to contrast hope with its antithesis. And I think that what the antithesis of hope is cynicism. And that is to sort of quote the late Mark Fisher, and in his book on sort of capitalist realism, what he says is that what destroys hope is the capitalist realist kind of statement that there is no alternative, right? Which we get from Thatcher and that whole era, that first wave of neoliberal politics, which of course has only entrenched itself since. And I think that actually what's important about hope is that it fractures that mirror, it fractures that glass, and it says, on the contrary, everything is possible if you refuse to accept that the system cannot be changed. And I think that's something that is practically demonstrated by these acts of solidarity, by these organizations that are just getting on in, as Carol said, often under the radar, and it's not sort of picked up by formal political science, because you wouldn't, if you, where we do most of our field work in Berkeley and Dagenham in East London, you would see very low turnout in local elections. You would see, you wouldn't see very many people being involved in political parties and all that kind of thing. But there's a heck of a lot going on at the level of the social, and and that's unmeasured, and it's almost invisible. But without it, those communities simply couldn't survive. And I think it's a terribly important point that Carol was making.
I agree. I think this is where the disciplinary sort of blinders matter. You talked about hope intermediaries. I mean, these are the sorts that political science would just dismiss as brokers or patrons or those engaging in clientelistic sorts of relations in a negative sort of with a negative imputation. I have to say, of course, it is changing to our, this way of thinking and analyzing is changing within the discipline, at least of political science. There is a, you mentioned Partha Chatterjee's work. There is a recognition that, these guys do play a role, a constructive role, a creative role, if you will. But you're right. I think one does need to think more and deeper than, referring to the voting patterns or the alleged apathy that lack of voting patterns, shows up. I think the point that, around pragmatism, I think that really, I suppose, also lends itself nicely to an ethnographic sort of approach, in the sense, that is what ethnographies do. They look at practice. They understand what, people are doing, as Carol, you mentioned earlier, and as Suryakant also sort of referred, rather than going with, presupposed concepts and then imposing them or not, just having a tick box exercise therein. So I think that is as always a useful reminder. There was one point you touched on, and I know we've run past the hour, but if I could just sort of get your thoughts in, and I don't think we talked enough about it. And of course, one can sort of have a really long discussion, but there was this talk about solidarity. And I think it's useful to, reflect on that, given the cynicism that often comes, around a certain way of thinking about the human, which is, the rational, self-seeking, goal-oriented, profit-oriented individual. And of course, solidarities, push back against those assumptions. I do have to say that I've found this sort of vision or this assumption of the human, as a rational, profiteering sort of individual, not only on the right, but also sadly on the left. There are a lot of folks on both sides of the spectrum who would probably sort of go on the side of cynicism than hope. But I just wondered, thinking about solidarity, what sorts of solidarities have you found, really profoundly invigorating or inspirational, both of you? What sorts of solidarities would you sort of like us to think about as we, proceed further about hope and think about hope? I don't know if Carol, did you want to come in, or Simon, if you wanted to?
No, I let Carol go first.
Yeah.
Well, what we witnessed during the pandemic was really how against this idea, what you mentioned, Suryakant, of the individual being the rational, goal-oriented, strategic, and being a bearer of constant interests. The unitary person, all the time the same and acting strategically just to follow their own interests. What we saw during the pandemic were people having to cope with the situation and feeling concerned wherever they could do something to be able to do it. And so the solidarity happened really in the neighborhoods that we studied here in France and around Paris, and in the poorest neighborhood in Paris, was with food and shelter. But basically, the first issue became food. And so it happened for students, because a lot of them needed, they couldn't go back, they couldn't have the usual public support. So the way that during the lockdown, they were on their own. And so solidarity really happened this way. And so it was possible to witness this at the local level, in the markets, and you had really neighborhoods, creating new associations, new solidarity organizations. And so there was this actual sense of responsibility and sense of justice happening, not from the wealthiest, but really from those who could, because they were seeing, they were watching what was happening. And so they imagined things and they created things just to cope with the situation. And so there were many people who were first timers in civic action, because it was just in front of their eyes. And so we see this how everyday experience and just the sense of, it's just in front of me, and I'm not rich, I don't have much, but we'll figure out something, because we cannot just let this like that. We need to do something since we witness it. So it's the very basic elementary sense of the public. You see something, it calls you. You cannot just be, the outsider and not care. So civic actions happened like that, and it was not people's interests. It was just like how the necessity of the situations called for that. So it was really interesting in that sense to witness how solidarity happened during pandemic.
Thanks. I think, that it's always useful to remind ourselves about solidarity, even in the most uncertain times, when you would least expect it. I know Mel, Simon, you referred to Mel earlier, who was sort of involved in a lot of the work during the peak of the pandemic, as it were. And I don't want to embarrass Mel, but Mel, if there's anything you wanted to sort of come in, now's the time.
Yeah, I mean, I can say a few words, and then Simon, if you want to take over, because I know we've sort of spoke about this before. But I think for me anyway, one of the most kind of profound, elements of solidarity that I observed was with the food bank that I observed and also interviewed the person running it, and it was, you know, as India said, it was right in the middle of the pandemic when I went down, really, and the person who was, you know, in charge of the food bank was clinically vulnerable and also part of a racialized group who were even more vulnerable, and they quite literally, you know, just said, I have no choice, you know, I need to help these people. If I don't go out and volunteer, these people won't eat and they will die. And so that, I mean, the element of self-sacrifice, I mean, it was horrifying to hear, but that was genuinely how they decided that they were going to do it, you know, that it was, they were going to risk their own lives in order to support loads of other people. And I think it leads on to a point that Simon kind of mentioned earlier, which is, you know, in the specific community that we were looking into, there's an awful lot of people there who are subject to immigration legislation, who are excluded from state support. But not only that, because of the hostile shift, are also terrified. So there are people who couldn't seek state support because they were excluded. But there was also exclusion based on fear. I think that people don't trust state organisations, that people didn't want to go to the council, didn't want to go to the people. And yeah, these organisations, this particular food bank really bridged that gap. So I think for me anyway, that's what, as you guys have been talking, that's the kind of example that really stood out the most.
Thanks, Mel. Again, I mean, we can never cease to say how grateful we are to you to have sort of stepped in at the time that you did. But I think it's really useful to sort of hear the understandings of solidarity and the practice of solidarity as well from you. Simon, anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I'm really glad that Mel sort of talked about the food banks, because I mean, I think it really is a very practical demonstration of that solidarity that we're talking about, and you know, and really coming from, you know, from the community, and in a very kind of non-judgmental way. And one of the things that I was, you know, going back to, you know, you mentioned Bhatta Chatterjee, and one of the things that I thought was very interesting about his study of the railway colony in West Bengal is that association talking about itself as a family. And you know, and Mel will, because she did the interviews, will confirm that is exactly how the coordinators of the food bank talked about the food bank and the people that came, and they would also have community meals there, you know, a bit later on when that was possible in the pandemic. And I think this is really, really important, because I think it does show that, you know, going back to some of the things that Suryakamp was suggesting, that the city can kind of allow some of these solidarities, which are kind of very ancient ones around kinship and blood ties and belonging, can actually take the good things and the positive aspects of that and extend them in a way that's really inclusive, you know, to sort of whole diverse range of different communities of people in need. Because fundamentally, you know, that's what, you know, the point why families survive, why they're such a resilient institution, is because they look out for each other and the more vulnerable and the weaker and so on, are looked after by the stronger and so forth. And that is kind of an ideal type of how community should work, but actually it's practiced among these so-called intermediaries of hope in a way that it's kind of, as Mel was saying, not practiced, or often sort of hostilely withdrawn by the state. And I think this is something which is really important for us to understand and to document, and to acknowledge also that this is a kind of a way of kind of creating a different type of world, a different type of society, which is not necessarily going to transform capitalism or anything like that. It's very pragmatic, but it will keep people alive, you know, and what could be more revolutionary than that, you know, is my argument. So, you know, to all the cynics on the left or the right, or whoever they may be, I think we just have to acknowledge that these are amazing people in our midst who are working with very limited resources, having to give up all of their spare time. Definitely the unacknowledged heroes of the harsh times that we're going through. And I think, you know, yeah, I would totally agree with Mel. I think if I'm looking for people to sort of really sort of say, you know, what gives me hope, I guess, as a researcher and indeed as a citizen, it's definitely these type of people, these type of organizations.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think it's a really useful point to end on, I think a lot of the reasons that people are wary of the idea of hope have been that, it's not revolutionary enough, as it were, or it doesn't sort of, look at or push for a total annihilation of injustice or of the sorts of, crimes almost that, continue to be committed. But I guess that's what distinguishes hope from utopia. Hope is what we are left with when utopia dies, and we witness some horrible crimes being committed in the name of utopia. And I suppose hope is the only way forward for most of the world, where you sort of you work incrementally, I guess, rather than call for or ask for the complete destruction of what are quite frankly unjust institutions. But that's not something that is about to happen. But we don't just give up hope. We continue to work the system the best we can. Well, thank you all so much for your time this Monday morning. And it's a pity Suryakant had to leave, but I'd like to thank him as well for his time. And of course, you, Simon, and you, Carol, thank you so much. And Mel, also thank you for all the work you've been doing, including making a special appearance today, but also before that, just organizing the entire consortium's sort of work on the social justice and social change strand, but also the broader work on the consortium. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone also for listening to us, and take good care and have a good rest of the week.
Thank you for the discussion.
Okay.
Right.
Bye. Bye. See you.